Hey church, how are you? I just wanted to take the opportunity today just to do a short little devotional video. Just as a reminder before I get into that, there's a few things that we're doing as a church. The first thing we're doing is we're connecting with Carlingford. We're doing that on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Watching and being a part of their service. So it's not just watching passively, we're actually doing this together and we're participating with Carlingford. And Riverside's doing a few things with the church, with the service as well. Then there's small group, catching up with small group, connecting with small group. This is all really important sort of stuff that we need to do. There's children's ministry stuff that gets sent out every week. That's been going really well. I've got some really positive feedback about how that's working. And then there is also just looking out for each other, doing those practical things. And, you know, if there's anything we can do, please let us know. If there's any way we can help you or care for you during this time, please let us know. And then I guess the last thing is also prayer, just holding each other up in prayer and praying for the church and praying for this nation and for the globe at this point in time. It's a really important time to be prayerful. So let's continue to do each one of these things and to continue to support each other. And in the next few months, we'll be on the other side and we'll be able to meet again and continue to travel along as a family, as one of God's ecclesias, one of his churches around the world. And so we look forward to that time. But I guess I was thinking a little bit more about COVID-19 and what are some biblical reflections upon COVID-19 and what does it mean for us as his children, as his followers? What does it mean when we read the scriptures and engage with it and to come to a point of being able to see where does Jesus fit in the midst of all of this? And I guess that was some of my thinkings. And so for me, there's a story that we're going to get to in a moment that, for me, actually really sums up a lot of this sort of stuff that we're going through at the moment. And it's one of the stories about Jesus in the Gospels. And when we go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we go through each of them. There's a whole bunch of different stories and there's a bunch of ideas that are coming out through Scripture. One of the ideas that we see through Scripture is that God reigns. God reigns supremely, utterly, and completely. This is a part of who Jesus is and a part of who we follow and who we worship. Many of us may not realize that Jesus reigns, but Jesus reigns. And Jesus reigns over a bunch of different dominions. We see a bunch of stories where Jesus reigns over the spiritual world and particularly over the demonic world, where there is a story in particular where there is a possessed man and Jesus prays that the demons would leave this man and they enter a bunch of pigs and then these pigs then run over a cliff and perish. And so we see this happening where Jesus has dominion and power over the spiritual world. We also see that Jesus has power over the sick, over the lame and the blind, and Jesus takes this one step further. We see that Jesus has dominion and power over death itself, and we see Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. And of course, in Easter, we celebrate that Jesus himself defeats and conquers death once and for all. This is the central idea of the Christian story and the Christian faith. But we also see throughout the Gospels that Jesus has dominion and has power and reigns supreme over the created order. He reigns supreme over all living creatures and the universe itself. We see this through a bunch of different stories, but we also see it actually in John's Gospel right at the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's how the Gospel of John starts. It's this very curious way of starting. Rather than starting with like a genealogy or the typical Christmas story, it starts off with this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This word here, this logos, is Jesus. And we see that John is taking his readers all the way back to in the beginning, in Genesis. And God, in the beginning, spoke the world into existence. The entire universe was spoken into existence. And John says, in the beginning was the Word, this logos, this idea of of God speaking the world into existence. Well, that word that was being spoken is Jesus. That's basically what John's getting at. He was with God in the beginning. Jesus was around way before he was born in Bethlehem. He's been around since the very beginning of time. And in fact, time was created through him. And we see this in verse 3. Through him all things were made that have been made. Without him nothing was made has been made. In him, in verse 4, in him was life. And that life was the light to all mankind. But let's go back to that idea in verse 3. We see this idea that through him all things were made. Anything that has been made through Jesus. When God spoke the universe into existence, he did it through Jesus. And then John goes one step further to basically say, not only was everything created through Jesus, actually, Jesus is the life. In the Greek, Jesus is the Zoe. The Zoe is the lifeblood, the life force of all living things. He is the heartbeat behind all of creation. He is the thing that sustains all the things around us. The entire created order is sustained through Jesus. Just a beautiful image of who this Jesus is. And so when we take it from this context, actually the story that we're about to look at actually makes perfect sense. Of course Jesus can do this. But the story that I guess I was reflecting on this week is actually a story that describes how Jesus has dominion and power and reigns supreme over the entire created order. And we see this in Mark's Gospel, although it's actually in the other Gospels as well. There is this small little story that most of us are probably fairly familiar with, where Jesus calms the storm. Jesus is asleep with his disciples on a fishing boat. Now, on the screen you can see right now some images, some footage of a fishing boat that was discovered a few years back in the marshlands around the Sea of Galilee. So basically the water had receded, the water levels had dropped so far that in the mudland appeared this particular boat. And this has been dated, and the historians have looked at it and they've said that this boat would have been around at the same time as Jesus. And that when we talk about fishing vessels, this is the kind of boat that they would have been in. It's not particularly big, is it? Can you imagine 12 people plus Jesus in this boat and Jesus asleep in this boat? It would have been quite tight, to say the least. But here we have this story of the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and a storm has started to rise. And it's a big storm. It's frightening them. It's scaring them. Here you have men who, some of which are professional fishermen. This is what they used to do for a living before they decided to follow Jesus as one of his disciples. In fact, Jesus finds a few of them, doesn't he, along the beach, and says, "Come, I'm going to make you fishers of men." These guys are experienced. They understand the Sea of Galilee. They understand what it means to be on a boat. They even understand what it means for a storm to whip up and how ferocious that can actually be while you're out on the water. These guys find themselves in the middle of this storm and they're afraid. They're very afraid. They think they're gonna die. And so what do they do at this point in time? Well, they wake Jesus up. They wake him up and they say, Rabbi, teacher, save us. They're pleading with Jesus to save them. And I find this really remarkable moment. Jesus is a rabbi and these guys are professional fishermen, and yet they've done everything they can to try to save themselves while on this boat. And they've come to a point where they know actually whatever they're doing isn't going to work. And so they turn to the only person else who they think could help. They turn to Jesus. Help us. Rabbi, save us. And what does Jesus do? Well, Jesus stands up and he does one of the most odd things you could imagine, as Jesus regularly did. He rebuked the wind and the waves. Here these disciples feel like they're going to perish. It is a dark night and the storm is raging and the wind is howling and the waves are crashing over the boat and they're in trouble. And Jesus rebukes the storm. And then the disciples, after seeing that the waves have now settled down and the wind has calmed down, they turn to each other. Who is this man? Who is this man that even the wind and the waves would obey him? Of course, we understand in John's Gospel that this man is actually the Zoe of all creation. He is the lifeblood, the sustainer of all living things. So actually it makes perfect sense that the created order would yield, that the created order would kneel before Jesus and obey him. The reason why, for me, this passage kind of, for me, gives good definition to what we're going through at the moment during COVID-19 is that at one level, right now, it can feel like we're in the midst of a storm. It really does. I mean, I'll be honest, Australia is actually doing really well. Australia is actually, we've had 20 people or so in the last 24 hours be tested and have found to be positive with COVID-19. 20 people in the entire nation. That's a pretty remarkable thing. We've got entire states like Western Australia who have not had a single new case of COVID-19 over the last couple of days. And yet we look around the world, we see that there's 3 million people worldwide who have been tested positive, and yet the figures are probably 10 times more than that, is the reality. That's what some of the studies are coming out to say, that it's probably a lot bigger than what just the testing has suggested. And we see the chaos that this has caused to humankind. It's massive. It's turned the world upside down. 3 months ago, if you'd said 1 billion people are going to be living in lockdown, you'd be like, nah, no chance. That's like a science fiction novel. The world is currently living through a science fiction model. And it is, at one level, like living through a storm, a ferocious storm, a storm where it looks like, for many people around the world, they may be worried and looking out saying, am I going to perish? Is this how it finishes? And that's a scary thought on one hand. And there is this idea coming through the Gospels where Jesus has dominion and power and reigns supreme over the created order. As well as sickness. We see that Jesus heals the lame and the blind, and all sorts of people are healed because of who Jesus is and because he reigns supreme over disease. And so Jesus reigns supreme over things like COVID-19. But it's also this idea that Jesus reigns over the entire created order that stands out for me. And that in the midst of this, there is this storm going on, and sometimes there is a storm going on externally, but that then creates like an internal storm that happens for each of us, whether that's anxiety or stress or fear or maybe even anger or frustration. And sometimes that storm can be started by something like COVID-19, but it then has ripple effects going outwards, as we see with this. There's this ripple effect that happens all through community, and particularly economically, where people's lives are turned upside down because some people don't have a job and they're not able to work anymore, and they're looking at their bank balance going, it's going down really quickly and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills. I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table for my family. And so then that creates another storm internally for us because of what's happening externally. Jesus, in this narrative, calms the storm. Yet I guess for me what stands out is this moment in the middle or towards the end, I guess, of this story, where the disciples, these, as I said before, these experienced fishermen who knew far more about how to survive in a storm in a boat than Jesus did, yet they come to a point where they no longer have any answers. And so, facing death, they turn to Jesus. Save us. Save us. And I guess for me, that's almost my prayer in the midst of all of this storm. Yes, Jesus will be able to calm the storm. And we believe that physically as well as emotionally. But I almost feel like in the midst of this, if people are feeling like this is crazy and that this storm is going to wash me overboard and I'm going to find myself in deep, dark waters and I can't swim and I'm afraid that the waves are going to be crashing over my head, if we find ourselves in that moment, it's at that time I think we need to be like the disciples. Rabbi, save us. Save us. And Jesus will do what Jesus does. Jesus will save us. Does that mean that Jesus is guaranteed to save anyone who calls on his name from COVID-19? Well, no. Not necessarily in a physical sense. All the Christians we see on the news with Jesus is my vaccine written down the side of their pickup trucks as they still turn up to church in large numbers, services with 500 or more people. People sort of proclaiming that they're going to be saved, and yet we see on the news that actually some of those churches have had people perish from COVID-19. Let me just say, that's bad theology. That's not what we're talking about here. Will we see stories of Jesus healing individuals from COVID-19? Absolutely. We will hear, when this is all said and done, there will be plenty of stories of people who were sick and people who were on the deathbed and the brethren, the Christian family, all in isolation, all in different places, coming together in prayer and praying and God's Spirit coming and bringing healing on people. Absolutely, I believe that will happen and that has happened, and we will hear those stories. But the reality is Christians still die, they still get cancer, they still get hit by drunk drivers. In the developing world, there's still millions of Christians who are perishing from malaria and thirst and hunger. All of these terrible things happen to Christians just as much as they happen to anybody else. But what Jesus does do is he brings salvation. He will save us. in a deeper, bigger way than simply just from a disease. And yet in the midst of that, there is also this internal saving, that actually Jesus calms the storm internally. So even in the midst of this external storm that's going on, internally, we will also find the peace that happens. Well, that's been some of my reflections this week. And if you have any feedback or want to talk to me about any of these things, give me an email, give me a call, and I'd love to touch base and have a chat to you. So thanks, church, for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, guys. Bless you.